Hello, everyone. Welcome to the class. Let's see. Okay, how's everyone doing this evening? You can unmute yourselves, I guess, or you can give a thumbs up. It's kind of awkward. On the one hand, I have trouble when I have silence on the other end. On the other hand, if you have your computer on and there's someone else making noise, anyway, happy to see you all. And this semester, we are going to be exploring Native American history, which I find to be really a fascinating subject, a great subject to teach, even though the story is often brutal and horrifying. We learn a lot from it. It's a way of challenging what we already know about history, and really challenges how we think about history. So we'll be doing quite a bit of that and thinking about this particular history, roughly from the 1830s to the present. And one of the real, has anyone, by the way, I've taught the first half of this class, and I'm just trying to remember if any of you was in the first half. I don't remember, and I apologize if I've forgotten that you were. But that's okay, because we'll cover enough so that you'll understand what happens subsequently and why I divided the year-long class into two sections right around 1830, because things do change. And one of the real, I don't want to say problem, but challenges with teaching Native American history of any kind is just understanding who these people are. Well, often when you're doing history, you kind of have a straightforward narrative, and you probably could put together a narrative of some kind of a history of your own, things that have, or history you have learned, a beginning, middle, and an end, and some coherent story. But with Native American history, you can kind of do that, but on the other hand, you're really talking about a lot of different people. And it's really not until the 20th century that Native Americans, or Indians, and I'll use the terms interchangeably, really began thinking of themselves as Indians, that is, having a relationship with other Native people. You can see some of this earlier. In fact, in the years just before our class begins, in the first decades of the 19th century, Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee, although his mother was a Creek, tries to organize a Native American movement, one of the most effective organizers in the history of the country, but fails. So we have attempts by Tecumseh and others to create a pan-Indian identity, but you still see very much a persistence of a Native person identifying him or herself as a Creek or a Choctaw or a Narragansett, and thus being at odds with their traditional rivals or adversaries. In 1980, which to me doesn't seem like that long ago, and I realize it was long before you were born, the Federal Department of Education tried to come up with a definition for Indian and couldn't, because it's too complicated. Sometimes we try to ascribe, blood, someone had, and that's really problematic, because most of us are descended from lots of different people. And so there's also the I don't want to say the problem of language, but the issue of language. Let me just tell you a few ways that Native people either have been defined or have defined themselves over the course of history. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And if for some reason this doesn't work, I'll hold on and I'll come back and figure out what I did wrong. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we're going to talk about this later, and I want to bear with me. It was a long summer, and I've forgotten most of what I used to know about operating this particular piece of technology. Okay, good. Okay, and I apologize. These maps aren't as clear as I was hoping they would be. You can see they're kind of color-coded. And let's see. You know, there have been different ways that anthropologists, sociologists, I'm just talking now about academics, historians, and others have tried to organize what we know about Native people. Just bearing in mind that there are hundreds of Native, well, right now, there are about 180 Native American languages being spoken in North America. And let me see if I can find this map that shows you the language groups in North America. Yeah, this was done in the 1830s, so it's actually close to the time we're talking about. And the colors represent language groups or language families. So think about that in the context of, say, European languages. Does anyone know how many European language families there are? Remember, I'm thinking about like the Romance languages. There are 5 of them, but that's one language family. Or Germanic languages, and there are a few of them. There's English, German, Danish, and let me think, I know there are other Slavic languages. So there maybe are 4 or 5 language families in Europe, but here in North America, you can see the different linguistic families each color represents here. So you have the green, which is quite extensive over the northern part of the continent. And those are the Algonquian languages, really. And this means linguists know these languages are related, even though you as a speaker of one might not be able to understand a speaker of the other. Typically, you would be able to get along with someone from a neighboring area who spoke a different language. For example, if you spoke Massachusetts, you probably could understand or communicate with someone who spoke Nipmuc because they're adjoining people. However, if you were Massachusetts and you were talking to an Arapaho, same language family, but it may not be intelligible to you, the same way someone who speaks Romanian might not be able to understand a speaker of Portuguese. And so you see these different language groups here in North America. Then the yellow, which you can see adjoining, that's the Iroquoian languages. And the Iroquoian, spoken obviously by the Iroquois, but then you can also look down further south on the continent. You see other Iroquoian groups. And so on, the Siouan, the pink in the center of the continent. All of these are varieties of people within this group who speak these different languages. And then if we look at California, there's an astonishing variety of languages spoken in California, which are unrelated to any other languages spoken in North America. And in the area along the Colorado River, the people that generally we call Pueblo, and they do live very similar ways of life. They're in towns built along the side on mesas, and they have very similar ceremonies, but they speak different languages. In fact, the languages themselves are different. You see, there's a Puebloan language, and then the Hopi language, and then the Zuni language. And the Hope are unrelated to the other languages spoken by people living similar ways of life. So language, it's fascinating. And I have to confess, I only speak one language. But it's fascinating to think of this variety of languages being spoken in North America. And one of the things we'll be talking about over the course of the semester are attempts now to revive some of the languages which have fallen into disuse, either through, well, actually, it's a story of why they fall into disuse. And this map shows us more specifically different tribes or nations. And, you know, tribe is one way of communicating who belongs to something. It used to be, we had to caution students about the negative pejorative aspects of using the word tribe. I'm not quite sure if that's still such an issue. It's usually people who are related by blood, who have kind of a common ancestry and common identity. And here you can see a wide variety of different people. And as I mentioned, you might be able to communicate with someone who lives close to you, but another downside of being too close to someone else is sometimes you don't get along. So there is, you know, you're more likely to, by the way, not get along with someone who lives next to you than someone who lives thousands of miles away. I mean, what would be the point? So this is part of the difficulty of coming up with some kind of a narrative for Native people or understanding their history, because their histories are different. And typically each Native group or tribe has its own story about how it came into being, the creation of these particular people. And much of what we know about the creation stories comes from, well, Jesuits who came to New France back in the 1600s and recorded what people told them about their origins. And of course, the Jesuits were hoping to convert these folks to Catholicism. And thus they were listening very carefully to find parallels between their story of how people came into being, so that they could then show that we're all really related. So and then stories are passed down. None of the Native people in North America develops a written language until the 19th century. The Massachusetts people have a written language that is developed by, again, Christian missionaries. John Eliot in the 1600s hoped to convert Native people to, well, Congregationalism, and so translated the Bible into their language, meaning he transliterated it. He had people who understood the language hearing it and then using letters from the Western alphabet to write down what they heard so that someone could read this out loud and then people hearing it could understand. You know, so no written language, which means too, you tell us, your grandmother tells a story to your mother tells the story to you, you'll tell the story to your children. The story is going to change. And over generations, it might. And some people are better storytellers than others. And in many societies, we find this. The good storytellers often were able to embellish or tell something in a captivating way. You will have similar themes. But what happened when the Jesuits wrote these stories down, or others wrote the stories down, is they became kind of frozen in time. And that's really not the same as having an oral tradition in which everything is passed down. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't have a written language. It's a great thing. It actually makes life a lot easier. But it's important to remember this about what happens when things are written down, and also it's important to remember what happens when things aren't written down. As historians, we're really bound by a written record. We can't make things up, and we might try, but we really are bound by what's written down. So that's somewhat limiting in how much we can understand. Now, another way that folks have tried to organize our thinking about Indians is the way they lived or the area they lived. And here you can see two things on this map of North America. You can see the names of individual people, but then you also see this broad conception like Eastern Woodland, Southeast, Great Plains, Southwest. Kind of obvious, this is where they are. But some scholars and others who are trying to make sense of this, and I'm not blasting people for trying to make sense of a complicated story, you're probably wishing I would make better sense of a complicated story rather than, just kind of rambling around with it. You have where people live, and does this give them a common identity? Well, really not, even though they have similar ways of life. Anyway, this is a lot of just kind of random speculation. Let me go back to where we were, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There are some kind of broad things that many Native people share with other Native people, but remember, these are all just, they might not be true for everybody. It's another one of the interesting things about Native history, Native American history, is we always have to remember these exceptions. I mentioned that no written languages, and typically Native people lived in relatively small societies, small villages. There are a few who create kind of bigger entities. One is, I'm sorry, the phone is ringing, and it's, is anyone expecting a call? No. Good. Typically, Native people lived in relatively small societies, which most of us actually live in small societies. When you think about it, even if we live in a city, we have a small circle, usually of family, friends, even if you're living in the largest city in the world. Native people lived in relatively small societies because they were dependent on the natural resources in their area for survival. And in New England, and I'll just start with New England because I know about it, they lived along rivers. And on the coast in Massachusetts, the Native people would fish, and in the winter they would go upstream to spend the winter where they were more secure. And there are several dozen Native groups along the coast of New England. We don't need to try to identify all of them now. Then you go further south, and in the area of the Southeast, by the early 19th century, we've developed, or actually 5 different Native groups have created relatively large-scale societies. Typically you will live in a village, and I'm making this way too complicated. No one's going to understand any of this by the time I'm through, which is not my goal, actually. Let me just try to start over with something that's a little more concrete. By the 1830s, there were about 100,000 Native people living east of the Mississippi. There were about 300,000 living west of the Mississippi. And for all of them, the big story is going to be the explosive growth of the white population that is going to be moving west. Now, for the Native people east of the Mississippi, before the American Revolution, the biggest and most important group were the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were 5 different nations who spoke related languages. And people lived in long houses. There would be 40, 50, 60 families living in one long house. Hence, the Iroquois did not call themselves the Iroquois. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, which means people of the long house, because that's how they lived. And there were these 5 separate nations of Iroquois. Sometime around the 1400s, that is before the arrival of the Europeans, the Iroquois decided it would make more sense for them as groups of people who spoke related languages to make a treaty with each other, to form a league with the other Iroquois, and they wouldn't fight with other Iroquois. They would, however, fight with other Native groups. There's 2 things that are very important for Native men to do. Are to be able to hunt, which you need to do in order to provide for your family, and you also need to be able to fight in order to protect your family. So the native men hunted and the native men fought. Now, if you're hunting, it means you're going off on a long journey, usually spending the winter hunting, which means that you're going to be running into other native people hunting in the same area. And then sometimes that leads to trouble. I don't know if any of you is a hunter and you may be able to understand this. Native women, on the other hand, did the farm labor. And one reason societies are able to prosper is because of developing agriculture. So most native people are not hunter-gatherers, they are farmers. It's the women, though, doing the agricultural work. And virtually every native society explains this because many of their origin stories involve a woman who introduces agriculture. And the primary things they are growing are corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, as they call them. And they also grow tobacco. Tobacco is used for ceremonies. And so you have the native women doing this agricultural work, which also means here on the coast of New England, the native women are responsible for harvesting the shellfish and the other fish. In the Charles River and these other estuaries, they build fish weirs, these big nets. The tide comes in, the fish swim into the nets, the tide goes out, the fish are trapped, and the women go and gather the fish and then dry them, smoke them so they can be preserved. You shouldn't keep fish more than a day or two, and they're not freezing them. They don't really salt them, they smoke them. So you have native women doing that kind of work, and fish also are used for fertilizer, and then using that to plant. The women also are responsible for doing things like building the longhouse, the wigwam, the teepee, whatever the family is living in, and taking them apart when they do move. Because if you are doing some hunting, you may move, or if you're living on the coast in the summer and the mountains in the winter, you're going to move back and forth. So this is what's happening in New England, and much of this is true for other native people. This somewhat migratory, but not traveling long distances, usually within a small area, except when you're hunting, in which case you may go a very long distance. So as I said, about 100,000 native people east of the Mississippi. The Iroquois had been the most powerful group, but the American Revolution is disastrous for the Iroquois. And they wind up really, some of them try to remain neutral, others support the Americans, others support the English. And after the war, actually during the war, an American expedition pretty much wiped out the agricultural capacity of the Oneida people. And then after the war, their land is given to soldiers as a payment for having served in the war. There are, west of the Iroquois in the Ohio River Valley, a lot of different native people who had for about 100 years been vying between English and French and trading with one or the other. Lots of small groups of native people living in somewhat similar ways of life, somewhat similar languages. And in the 1790s, they fight a series of wars against the United States and ultimately lose as white population is moving into places like Ohio and Indiana. And this is what gives rise, as I mentioned, to Tecumseh and his alliance in the 18 teens. And on the other side, thinking geographically of the mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee, I don't know if any of you has been to Ohio or Indiana, or if any of us would have a reason to go to Ohio or Indiana, but they're quite fertile areas, relatively flat. And then you have a chain of mountains along the Ohio, and then you go further south into what are today Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And again, you have kind of broad, flat land, punctuated or irrigated by these big rivers. And here you have a number of native groups speaking similar languages who do create bigger organized societies. And these are typically called by us the 5 civilized tribes. Civilized because they're practicing agriculture in a big way. They're living in towns. And these are the Cherokee are one of the most important. And their neighbors, the Creek in what is today Alabama. and then the Choctaw, the Chickasaw. There are other native people in the area. The Cherokee were relatively recent arrivals into this territory. They spoke an Iroquoian language, and not the others spoke Muskogean, different varieties of a Muskogean language, live in similar ways. And in the early 19th century, well, the Cherokee had sided with the British during the American Revolution. And one of the reasons Georgia was so adamant about ratifying the United States Constitution was they had the Cherokee on their borders and they needed protection against the Cherokee. And the Cherokee in 1785 had made a treaty with the United States establishing their boundaries, but Georgia, both fearful of the Cherokee, also wanting the Cherokee land, really ignores the boundaries. They settle in areas the Cherokee claim. We'll be talking more about the Cherokee as the semester goes on. I don't want to get distracted by talking about them right now. Then the Creek didn't really call themselves Creek. They were called this because they lived along these rivers. And I should say, one of the most important things for Native peoples economically in this period was trade, because the Europeans who were coming and then the Americans wanted to trade with the Indians for furs. I mentioned that the Indians hunted, and this is going to be true throughout the history, even the history in the 1500s and 1600s. Trade for furs becomes one of the real drivers of the economy for Native people. First, it's beaver pelts, which are in high demand because for the beaver pelts, you can make felt hats, which were the fashion in Europe in the 1600s. Then it's deer skins, and Native people are trading deer skins, which they can get for things that they cannot manufacture. Iron pots, which are a lot easier to cook in than clay pots. Woven cloth, which it turns out is more comfortable than a deer skin or something made out of the fibers of plants. Alcohol, and alcohol is something that has a pernicious effect on Native people. And when the market for deer skins and other furs falls, the Native people will sell land, which is very much in demand among Europeans. That's the thing the Europeans really want, is the land. And this is kind of a persistent theme in Native American history. So you also have the Creek who live along the rivers of Alabama. And again, hunting, and the women are doing agricultural work. They're living in pretty big towns. And then to the west in what's now Mississippi, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, as well as other small groups. And they form their governments have similarities with other Native governments, although they're doing them on a bigger scale. Most people's focus really is their village or their clan, and clan lines can transcend village lines. Very important. You can't marry within your clan. You have a real connection with your clan. And another fun fact about Native people is in most of the societies, your inheritance, who you are, really comes from your mother rather than from your father. And there's good reason for this. Yes, Sana, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, wasn't it like the reason why they were giving up their land was because of the speculators wanted more land for like a cheaper price or something like that? Isn't that why? And they're like forcing the Native Americans to move out of their, and that's when like the Removal Act came or something. Is that what you're talking about?
That's generally true, but it's something that you see persistently over the course of history, is that land is one thing. I mean, as it meant, we don't know how many Native people there were at the time the Europeans arrived in North America. There are all kinds of estimates, and I don't think we will ever know. We know that most of them died as a result of the European arrival from disease, and that's something else that also persists over this history. Land is something the Europeans valued. So I'm glad you asked the question, because this will help to explain a lot. Native people used land differently from the way the Europeans did. The women did the agricultural work, and they tended it very carefully. When the first Europeans come, they notice how the area is cleared. There still are trees, but there are a lot of plantings in the trees, in among the trees. The native people would do what we would call controlled burns of different areas to refertilize an area. And they understood this. They understood fertilization and so on. They're producing enough really for their survival. I mean, they will have something of a surplus, and they'll have seed corn and so on. The Europeans are going to use land somewhat, plus the men are hunting. And if you're hunting, you don't want land fenced off and cleared. I mean, one reason you're keeping a lot of the wooded areas is so that wild animals will have places to be. The Europeans do have a desire for land, but they also are bringing cattle and sheep and pigs. The native people, before the arrival of Europeans, had not domesticated animals larger than dogs. There are lots of big animals in North America, but they're not taming elk, deer, moose, or bears, these other big animals here. The Europeans bring cattle, and the cattle eat everything in sight. And the Europeans also in the southern colonies are planting tobacco, and they would need more land for tobacco. So this is in the 1600s. They're pushing the native people out to grow tobacco. In South Carolina, it's going to be rice. So you have the Europeans using land in a different way, and also seeing that they can, I'll get to you in a minute, Trevor. I'm still wrapping this up, I hope. If I'm still talking in an hour, remind me that should be done answering Santa's question, which is a very good one. The Europeans wanted to own the land. For a native person, typically, someone saying, I want to own all of the land in this area would be the same as you saying you wanted to buy all of the air in the room. And we would say, that's ridiculous. You can't own all the air in the room. And you say, but I'll give you something for it. And we'll think, well, why not pay Santa for the air in the room? And she's a fool for thinking she can own all the air in the room. Then turns out the Europeans actually did have a way of owning all the land. They could fence it off. You know, they could make sure they could have the wild animals are pushed out by the cattle and the sheep and so on. And so they do then own the land, and you can't use it. So ownership means something different. But you're right, there is land speculation going on. There's a press for more land. And as cotton becomes the crop, by 1820, cotton is the largest American export. And by the middle of the 1820s, early 1830s, cotton is being woven into textiles in Massachusetts. So there's a demand here for cotton. There's a demand in England for cotton. We can grow a lot of cotton here. So there's a demand for this land that happens to be where the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw are living. And so the land becomes more valuable. I mean, there isn't the same push for land in, say, West Virginia or in mountainous areas, but there is here because it's fur land. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it is really one of the driving forces behind the Indian Removal Act and what happens. Trevor? Whoops.
It's not really that important of a question, but you mentioned that they domesticated dogs. Were those dogs that were native to this land, or do historians know if they were brought with them?
Yeah, no, they were native to this land. This raises another question about where do native people come from? I mentioned all native people have a story about their origins, and it always involves we right here, where we're from. And I know it was after I was done with elementary school, teachers began harping on the Bering Sea, the land bridge theory about they came from Asia. And the story was this was around 11,000 years ago. And then fairly recently they found, and so the people theoretically crossed the Bering Strait by land, this land bridge, and came to the Americas, and then all became Indians. The problem is just fairly recently they've been finding human settlements in the southern part of Chile from 18 to 20,000 years ago. So how do the people get there so quickly? I mean, 7,000 years before this land bridge formed. Again, the land bridge is a theory. And yet dogs, coyotes are related to dogs. In fact, they have the same DNA. So I'm not recommending domesticating coyotes. Wolves also are related to dogs, but yes, so they are raising dogs here. By the way, once the Europeans arrive, the native people do take to raising sheep and pigs. They don't really take to cattle as much, but sheep and also horses. Horses and sheep become really essential to native life. The Navajo people who live out in what is today Arizona weave a lot, and it's almost inconceivable for the Navajo not to be weaving. And there's also, I've heard or read of Apaches saying, you think of Apaches always on horses. There can't be an Apache without a horse. Well, they would have been before the Spanish arrived with horses. All of these animals introduced are going to have a huge impact on native societies. Some negative, in fact, cattle really do a lot of damage. And if any of you love cattle, I'm not anti-cattle, but they do a lot of damage by eating stuff. I love cows. They're big, funny animals, and I wouldn't want one in my yard. But sheep, pigs, and horses, the native people take to in a bigger way than they do cattle. Is anyone here a fan of cattle? Should have asked that before I started ranting about our bovine friends. Okay. So you have, in the years immediately after the American Revolution, the Washington administration, by the way, the Constitution of the United States gives the United States government jurisdiction over Native American affairs. They didn't want states doing this, and so the federal government has this power to make treaties with Native people. And the Washington administration sees a real problem with with the relationship between Native people and Americans, in that it had typically been bad. And Henry Knox, who was the Secretary of War, has an idea for civilizing the Native people. That is one thing that Americans saw in this period, of whatever their political position, was that there were a lot more Native people 200 years ago than there are now. And they're wondering why this is. How come the Native people have died off? And they know there have been wars. They also know there have been diseases that have spread among Native people. One real incontrovertible fact is that the Native people had not been exposed to smallpox, whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, mumps, all of these diseases except smallpox, if you get when you're very young or a child, are relatively benign. If you get them as an adult, they can kill you. Smallpox is different. Smallpox, 30% of the people who contract smallpox die. And smallpox over the course of human history was one of the biggest killers of people. And then if you've once had smallpox, you never get it again. The Europeans had been exposed to smallpox. So if there's an epidemic and you've already been exposed, you're not going to get it. Native people had never been exposed to it, and they're going to die of it in huge numbers. And these epidemics continue to plague Native people well into the 20th century. They're called virgin soil epidemics because a disease that has never been here suddenly is. I think we all have been thinking a lot lately about diseases and things we have not been exposed to. So this is a timely thing. So the Native people are dying of disease, and this is something these Europeans realize, but they're looking at this in a different way. That is, Henry Knox and George Washington are saying, well, they're looking at this as two civilizations in conflict with each other, and one seems to be winning. And Washington and Knox were genuinely humane people who didn't want to have the Indians die off because of their inferior civilization. That would be immoral and wrong. So Knox and Washington propose a civilization program. And another real difference they noted between Native societies and European societies. In European societies, the men are the ones who do the agricultural work, and the women do the cooking, the cleaning, and so on. Hunting for Europeans was a gentleman's pursuit. It was kind of something you did when you had the wherewithal to go off and hunt a fox. And they come here and they see the native men are hunting and the women are doing all the agricultural work. It's astonishing to see how many of these commentators talk about these overworked women who are doing all of this agricultural work when the men are just off hunting. So they think what we really should do as a way of helping the Indians survive is get the men to do the agricultural work. And also, if they're farming instead of hunting, they're not going to be wandering around chasing wild animals. They'll be settled down. They won't need as much land. And this gets back to Sana's point about the Europeans do want land. So if the Indians are using less of it, we can sell it. And so we want the native men to start doing this kind of work and the women not to be doing the agricultural work and the men to stop hunting. So one thing that Henry Knox does is have his agents, Indian agents appointed by the War Department, introduce spinning wheels. So the native women, instead of doing all the agricultural work, will do what women in European American society did, which is to spin yarn. That is to take wool or cotton with a spinning wheel, you spin yarn, you then can sell the yarn, and this benefits, well, everyone, because then they're actually part of this cash economy. So this is actually something that's being proposed by as federal policy in the 1790s to get the women to spin, the men to stop hunting. Now, I also should say, with the end of the Revolutionary War and the defeat of Native people who had sided with the British, like the Iroquois and the Cherokee, the men are no longer really able to do what had defined them as men. There's less area to hunt, and they're not really able to fight. And they are reluctant to take up farming because that had always been women's work. So men don't want to do women's work typically. And the women are also reluctant to give up farming because, of course, if you're farming, it's economically important. It's really essential to a society that someone is producing food. Anyway, I'm kind of making this overly complicated. This is just kind of one of the big trends here in Native American life, this attempt by the government of the United States to transition the men from hunters into farmers and the women from farmers into spinners. And also there is this constant attempt to introduce Christianity. And this is something that had been going on since the arrival of Europeans, with different missionaries among the Indians trying to inculcate them with the Christian ideals instead of the native religious practices. Are there any other questions? I should give you a chance to ask a question that might get me on track or have you think about something, talk about something that is really of more interest to you.
They're like the lynching. The lynching was huge, wasn't it?
Not at this time, no.
Oh, okay.
No. That becomes a bigger issue later on, really after the Civil War. You are going to see fights. In fact, one of the big stories here in the 1830s comes out of a fight between two Indians. This is, the Cherokee. Let's just focus more on the Cherokee. I've kind of given you a very broad idea about what's happening among the Cherokee. Among a lot of the native folks, particularly in the Southeast, there had been, as I said, most inheritance goes through the mother. And so among the Cherokee and the Creek, we have tribal leaders whose father was actually a Scottish trader. One is among the Creek, Alexander MacGillivray, who becomes the chief of the Creek in the 1790s. His father, Lachlan MacGillivray, was a Scottish trader. As he comes here, sets up in Pensacola, Florida, and then has the Creek bringing furs down to Pensacola, which he then buys and ships off. He becomes quite wealthy, and he marries a Creek woman, and she is from one of the leading houses among the Creek, and thus his son becomes the tribal leader in the 1790s. Among the Cherokee, John Ross. Ross is not an Indian name. His father was a Scottish trader. The important thing, though, was his mother. His mother was a Cherokee. And Ross becomes he's going to become the principal chief of the Cherokee once they write a constitution, because the Cherokee look around and see what's happening. This is in the 1800s. They had sided with the Americans during the war against the Creek. The Creek go to war against the United States in 1811, and it's actually one of the biggest wars in American history. And in 1811, the Creek attack a Fort Mims, in the southern part of Alabama. And Fort Mims was a fortified position. There was a big cotton gin there, owned by Creeks, because the Creeks realized cotton is really the thing to do. Much more profitable than hunting for furs. We'll grow cotton the way the white people across the river are growing cotton. And then we'll put the cotton in a cotton gin and turn it into cloth and sell it. So the Creek and these other folks in the Southeast are developing the same kind of agriculture that the whites are practicing. And in some cases, even having enslaved African Americans working for them, that is, buying slaves. And the slave trade had been going on among Indians and among whites for a long time. So the Creek have starting to cultivate cotton and so on. And there's kind of a reaction among some Creeks who think that these guys who are growing cotton are doing too much. They're getting ahead of themselves. And so a related story here, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, is there is also among Native people, this is a time of great dislocation. Our whole world has changed. The things we used to be able to do, we no longer can. We no longer really have control of our lives. And we have a number of stories of Native people, typically Native men, who have visions, and they say, we're really on the wrong track. There was one among the Delaware in the 1760s. And then in around 1800, there is one among the Iroquois, Ganiadigo, who was also called Handsome Lake. And Handsome Lake, it's after the war, there's not much for Iroquois men to do. And he is kind of a drunk, and he passes out. His family thinks he's dead. And while he's not dead, he's just in this comatose state. And in this comatose state, he has this vision where the Great Spirit speaks to him. He actually is introduced to the Great Spirit, and the Great Spirits, and also to Jesus and the Great Spirit are together. That is, we've had a century or more of missionizing here. So the stories of the New Testament and Old Testament, the stories of the traditional Iroquois story are familiar to him. And the lesson he gets is Native people have to stop doing things the way the white people are doing, and have to stop drinking, take better care of your children. The men should hunt again, and we shouldn't be wearing European clothes. So that's kind of the message that Handsome Lake has for the Iroquois. Similar prophet emerges among the Shawnee, Tenskwatawa, who is the brother of Tecumseh. There's a similar prophet among the Creek in this same period, all saying, stop doing things the white people are doing and go back to the way we were doing things. The reason life is such a mess is because we've given up the ways of the ancestors. So there is this reaction against these changes going on among Native people, and this happens among the Creek. A prophet named Francis comes along and says, we have to stop doing the things the white people are doing, which means the women shouldn't be spinning. So there's actually a move to smash all these spinning wheels because we're doing the wrong thing. And smash the cotton gin. One reason the cotton gin at Fort Mims is fortified. And the people around the cotton gin are also Creek. And so in 1811, there's an attack by Creek against other Creek who are protected by a militia unit from Mississippi at Fort Mims. And somewhere between 200 and 500 people are killed. This is actually the largest Indian attack in the history of the country at Fort Mims in Alabama. And you do something like this, you get the attention of others, and this is what brings then the militias of Tennessee and Georgia into Alabama in the Creek War. And the Tennessee militia is led by Andrew Jackson, who's going to become a big part of the story. But again, fighting alongside, we're with Cherokee and Choctaw. People had always been hostile to the Creek. And Jackson has Cherokee warriors and Choctaw warriors joining in the fight against the Creek. And one of the culminating battles is at Horseshoe Bend, Alabama in 1814. And this is the biggest Indian defeat in the history of the country at Horseshoe Bend. And after this, Jackson forces the Creek to sign a treaty by which they give away all of Alabama to the United States. President Madison thinks that's too much. He tries to get the treaty modified, but can't. Shows you something about how effective Madison was against someone like Jackson. So the Creek lose most of Alabama in this war. The Choctaw and the Cherokee had supported the United States in this war, but that's really not going to help them 10 years down the road. So you have these wars in the 18 teens. The Shawnee also had joined with the British in their war against the Americans unsuccessfully. And so you have this flood of folks going into Ohio and now into Alabama. And the Cherokee, though, having made this alliance with the United States, feel pretty secure, but their time is going to run out because the land is becoming too valuable. So among the Cherokee, there is a split. I mentioned John Ross, son of a Scottish trader. And on the other side, among the other leaders of the Cherokee were the family of the Ridge, a man known as the Ridge. His name in Cherokee meant that he walks on top of the ridge. And then he fought with Jackson during the Creek War, in which he was a major. Sometimes he's thus called Major Ridge. He sends his two sons. Yes, Trevor?
Could you just repeat, you said at the beginning of that chunk, were McGillen and Ross related in some way, or was McGillen involved with a different tribe?
McGill of Ray was a Creek, but he died in the 1790s. I'm sorry, I'm throwing out lots of things I do know, and so no. And he's not related to Ross. Ross's father was a guy named David MacDonald, who was Scottish. And Ross's Cherokee name was Kowiskowi, which means little white bird. Again, you asked a simple question. I'm giving a more complicated answer than I should. And tell me when I'm doing this, because I don't want to have people hopelessly confused. You want to know who is important to the story. Ross is important. Father is Scottish. Mother is Cherokee. And his mother, by the way, is also the daughter of a Scotsman and a Cherokee. Her mother was Cherokee. Her father was Scottish. And Ross had also served under Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. And the Cherokee by this time do have a national council. There are several different bands or groups of Cherokee. And like the Iroquois, they have created a governing structure really to look out for foreign affairs and to also prevent one Cherokee chief from selling land, because they realize that land is the one thing we have that the whites really want. So we shouldn't sell it to them. But it's tempting if someone offers you alcohol or trade for land, you may be tempted to take it. However, it's not in the best interest of all of us to have the land sold. So you see this among a lot of Native people, prohibitions against selling land. And that's one of the big things that their prophets have said we have done wrong. So John Ross is not related, he's a Cherokee. So, by the way, is the Ridge. The Ridge is also Cherokee. And the Ridge sends his sons, though, to be educated in a boarding school up in Connecticut. In Cornwall, Connecticut, there is a boarding school run by the American Board for Foreign Missions. And the foreign missions really want to Christianize the Indians. And so encouraging a Cherokee leader like the Ridge to send his sons and his nephew to boarding school in Connecticut is a good thing. And for Ridge, this is a way for them to learn the ways of these people. And in fact, his son and his nephew go to this boarding school. They meet local girls. This is in the 1820s, and they get married. And there's a scandal in the town of Cornwall because of these local girls marrying Indians, and this forces the school to shut down, but not before the Ridge brothers, John Ridge and his brother, and their cousin, Elias Boudinot, Boudinot. I should say Elias Boudinot's real name was Wati. The name Elias Boudinot was a congressman from New Jersey. He had been Speaker of the House in the 1790s. Another thing that Native people do often is have different names. John Ross had a Cherokee name. The English people, Americans, find it difficult to pronounce the Native names. And so it's not unusual for a Native person to have more than one name or to take different names over the course of his life. This makes it even more confusing, even more complicated. These people do change their names and the characters change their names. But in this case, I'll try to keep this as full, as clear as I can. Ross was actually married to someone who might have been related to the Ridge, but that's beside the point. If you're trying to keep notes of this genealogy, well, let us know at the end how it works out. Okay, so you have Ross and Ridge are both practicing plantation agriculture in this area of Georgia, Tennessee, and they're growing corn as well as cotton, also buying slaves. And as I said, the Ridge sends his sons to be educated up in Connecticut. And in the wake of this, they recognize that there is this great pressure on them to sell land. So they do a couple of things in the 1820s to try to protect themselves against encroachments by whites. And one is to form a Cherokee constitution, to create a Cherokee nation. And they draft a constitution. And the constitution, well, the boundaries of the Cherokee nation have been set by treaty with the United States. So they say, okay, the Cherokee nation, and they'll have an elected president. At this time, they still did have a hereditary chief, a guy named Pathkiller, who was almost 100 years old at this time. He had been around for a long time, but he is the hereditary chief. And typically in Native American society, you become a chief or a sachem, depending on how they call it, through the respect in which you're held by others. You know, Native societies operate through a consensus. So even if you are the sachem, it doesn't mean you order people around. It means you are the person that they look to for counsel and also the person responsible for defending the society. So Pathkiller had these credentials for leadership. And also one way you get to be a leader in Cherokee in most Native societies is through your ability to articulate a position, through your speaking, your power to convince others. Most Native societies, as I said, operate through a consensus. And we would sit around and discuss an issue, and usually each person would have a turn to speak, and the whole group had to decide something before it happened, which means these societies tend to be fairly conservative. And however, there also is a tendency for, you know, Trevor didn't like what we decided, so he's going to go off and do something on his own. He could do that, but then he's doing that without our sanction, and he knows that. It gets kind of complicated. You know, we live in a society where we vote, and whoever gets more votes is then the leader. And then the others should go along with that decision, knowing that in 4 years you have another chance. That's not the way the Native societies typically work. They have consensus, they look to elders for counsel, and everyone gets a chance to speak. But typically we're not going to make big dramatic changes. You're not going to become the SACAM by saying, I want to utterly transform this society. We kind of like this society, so we're doing what we've always done. So this is going on among the Cherokee. You have some of the leaders like the Ridge and Ross practicing plantation agriculture because this is a way to make money, but agreeing we shouldn't sell land. Then as a way to protect ourselves, what we're going to do is create a constitution, a government. And we'll have rules. No one is able to sell land. We'll have schools. We'll do the other things that a government should do. I'm going to ask, why don't we take a break at this time, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes and we'll get back to the Cherokee and tell you more about what's going on among them. So it's about 10 minutes and we'll come back and refreshed for more on the Cherokee. mentioned, Native Americans did not have written languages, and yet they did have histories. And one of the things we are doing, of course, is studying history. And how do you remember history without a written language? And there are two kinds of things that I wanted to do next. One is this earlier I sent you by email, and I also have on the PowerPoint and in the Blackboard space a couple of documents. And let's see if you are able to access the documents. Why don't we take a look at, it's called Lone Dog. And it's actually the thing you see behind me, the winter count. And Lone Dog was a Yanktonai Nakota. That is, he was part of what we would call the Sioux. The Sioux, broadly speaking, have three big groups: Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and the term actually Dakota, Nakota, Lakota means the people. Sioux comes from a word it might be Ojibwe, meaning bad people, and it's a French, Sioux. You can probably detect that the French were involved in coining that word, because when they asked the Ojibwe, who are those people, the Ojibwe had a long word that meant they're really bad people that you shouldn't have anything to do with. And the last part of that was Sioux. And thus these people became the Sioux. And they called themselves Nakota, Lakota, Dakota. Anyway, long story, Lone Dog lived in the 19th century. And his responsibility every year was to do the winter count on this buffalo robe. And so the document, which I hope you can see, is the winter count. And what I would really like to do is have us look in this in small groups. So we're going to attempt to do breakout rooms, and I'm not sure if it will work. And you and a couple of other students can take a look at this and look carefully at it and decide on one of the events that you want to try to explain. I don't know if you're able to see it. Let me just see if I can. Okay, I'm going to arrange you into 5 breakout rooms. Let's see if this works. You should be invited to join a breakout room.
Professor.
I'm hungry.
Okay, so good. So I will see you all next week.
All right,
Happy
see
Labor
ya.
Day.
Bye.
Take
Have
care.
a good
Bye.
weekend.
You too.